Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Well, thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Larry Tranel, a dairy field specialist in Northeast and Southeast Iowa. And I'm here today with my Extension Dairy colleagues, Fred Hall from Northwest Iowa as a dairy field specialist, and Jen Bentley, a dairy field specialist also in Northeast Iowa. So we're going to discuss today's topics with our guests. So welcome back to the podcast, Fred and Jen. So today we're joined on the podcast by Mark Licht, an associate professor and cropping systems specialist, and Shelby Gruss, assistant professor in Forage Extension, both with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, as we discuss the collaboration of resources for farmers adapting cover crops. So welcome to the podcast, Mark and Shelby. And for our listeners, please introduce yourselves. So we don't have any listeners, do we? Okay, so thousands of Iowa farmers plant cover crops annually to help reduce soil erosion, work with their crop rotations, increase soil organic matter, suppress weeds, minimize soil compaction, scavenge excess nutrients, and provide supplemental livestock grazing. A large percentage of Iowa farmers use cereal rye, oats, wheat, radishes, turnips, and the like. However, there are many other cover crop options available. And recently, Iowa State University Extension and Outreach and Iowa farmers interested in adopting the practice of trying new cover crops collaborated on some crop fact sheets for Iowa farmers with specific goals on their operation. So, Mark, would you give us a little bit of background on the development of these cover crop resources, what they entail, and how farmers are using them?
Yeah, so the idea behind these cover crop fact sheets came about, we've been thinking about it for several years, and we finally got to doing it this year. And I say we because it was a collaboration between myself and some colleagues at the NRCS here in Iowa. And part of this came about, just knowing that there's a number of different cover crop species out there. We typically focus on maybe a handful, if we're lucky, 2 handfuls of them. And so we wanted to provide enough information about these various species that are available that, farmers could start to compare and contrast and really think about which cover crop species might be good for them and help them attain the goals that they were going for.
So if you see the dairy farm in my background pictures, so that they use cover crops they call a cocktail mix, which is a mixture of them. So are most of the cover crops used in Iowa and with these dairy farmers, they're kind of sole ones, or some work better in combinations than others?
Most of the cover crops that we use in Iowa are actually single species, although now if you want to get some enhanced cost share benefits or longer cost share periods off the initial, you have to have those enhancements. And so that means you have to have more than one species out there. So we're starting to see that. If it's in a non-livestock setting, they're adding oats or triticale to what is mostly being used as cereal rye. And so that's how they're getting it. But I think there are some definite advantages to using, a mixture. And those advantages come into play really quite quickly, especially when you think of, livestock grazing or pulling some of that tonnage off for feeding elsewhere.
So as you were doing this, putting them together, were you measuring just tons or milk per acre? Or give us an insight on what you were looking for.
Yeah, so I am an agronomist, so milk per acre is a foreign term for me, but I'm sure you can all educate me on it, and I would take that. So with these fact sheets, what we're really focused on, were a number of different things, right? But some of it was very simple, much more agronomic, like identifying features, cultural traits, then getting into some planting information, right? And then on the back side of it, we think about some of the performance ratings, and then just some additional considerations, whether they be agronomic or in some cases, we do note some species as good for grazing or don't graze these or be careful when grazing these, right? And so that would probably be the extent of how we looked at it. And most of this information, we were we were diving into literature, scientific literature, and occasionally we, run across fact sheets and publications from other universities that had useful information in it. But we weren't generating anything new, I would say. We were just more aggregating a wide variety of information for these.
Shelby, how do you see cover crops being used throughout the state?
Yeah, I think cover crops are a great opportunity, especially for livestock and dairy producers. There was a study done by the Economic Research Service with the USDA, and they had shown that cover crop usage in dairy production, anybody that planted it, about 69% of them had used it for mechanical harvest, and up to about 11% used it in grazing situations. You're talking about these cocktail mixtures. I think we're seeing those a little bit more on livestock farms because they're thinking about trying to ensure they have a balanced diet, where when we're talking more about row crop production, we're seeing them using more individual species in those situations. I think these fact sheets are really helpful in giving you an idea of what you can plant when. And then I've seen quite a few more people using a double cropping system where they go from corn silage to a cereal rye or a triticale for another haylage harvest for the following spring, going back into corn silage. So being able to maximize that forage production throughout the year.
Yeah, I'm finding people that do a really good job on the cover crops with the cocktail mixes, especially. They do a really very nice job of creating food plots for deer. So I figure if the deer like it, the livestock are going to like it too. Is there any other way that you're specifically seeing dairy producers using the cover crops?
I think dairy producers using cover crops, something to think about is silage can be really difficult on our soil health. We're removing all of the above ground stover, and so we could be depleting some of our soils a little more quickly. And so having those cover crop mixtures coming in and we're grazing them and leaving a bit more residue can help keep our soils healthy for continued corn silage production throughout the years. And so that could be an additional benefit in those situations. Also prevent plant acres or case of something failing, such as the floods that we had this year up in Northwest Iowa. These cover crops can come in. These fact sheets will give you a lot of information about when you can plant and how you can get those in the field quickly and what we can get to produce more silage in situations like that. So keeping that ground covered, keeping our soils healthy, things like that.
So some dairy farmers might say that they are using cover crops to kind of increase their total tonnage because they might be getting 3 crops in 2 years. Any research that alludes to that on the profitability or the practicality of that?
That's a great question. I mean, I know there is some that show that economically you can make more money by getting that extra crop in. But I think some of the research is still kind of diving into what cover crop mixtures are more beneficial than others and how we should be implementing them. A lot of the focus on cover crops currently have been how we can implement them into just row crop situations. And so really getting an understanding of how they're benefiting our dairy and livestock producers is super helpful. I think there's been some research going in as well, how grazing, if we're grazing smart and we're not grazing when wet, we're avoiding compaction problems and some of the main concerns that many of our producers have by putting grazing our cover crops. So I think they're definitely an additional benefit. And if you're selecting the correct one at the time, you definitely are going to be seeing an increase in production.
So if we take away, like, say, the most common, like cereal grain type cover crops, what would be the next couple go-tos that you think people should think more about in dairy, beef, whatever operations there? I mean, we just haven't done a lot with in the past. Is there anything up and coming?
That's a great question. I think one of our hard problems that we have here, specifically in Iowa, is we have a short season after that corn silage crop comes off. And so we have to have something that grows really quickly that we can get fall production, because most of our things are not going to survive over winter. I know there's a big interest in Balanza clover because it seems like it's a clover that's going to be able to overwinter. So that could be a potential possibility. And then if we can get our if we can get that cover crop established earlier, then we're looking at some fall grazing things like the turnips that you were talking about. People do have a large interest in hairy vetch, but that it does have some problems with palatability and not necessarily a great grazer. But that adds that nitrogen benefit back. Mark, do you have anything that has some interest recently?
The biggest thing I was thinking of is more than like the turnips, quite honestly, from a fall grazing perspective. And if you're following a silage harvest, you can probably get some decent production out of those yet. You could try something like cowpeas, but obviously they're gonna winter kill. But they tend to do okay in warmer, drier conditions. And so just from the establishment, standpoint, they may be able to take off, with that a slightly earlier time frame than just waiting for grain harvest.
Let's ask Larry's same question, but refocus on forage production to be ensiled or rolled up. Because, quite frankly, in this part of the world where I'm at, nobody grazes. It's something we've got to be able to harvest and roll up or ensile.
Yeah, so turnips and stuff, if we're talking about fall ensiling, turnips can be difficult just because they have a really high moisture content. And so that can be really hard on mechanical harvest. So you'd be thinking about planting that with probably a grass, some type of grass in that situation. But those small grains really do fit well in that ensilage situation. Typically you get enough growth in the fall going into next spring for having a silage harvest in those situations. Sometimes I think cocktail mixtures can be difficult in those situations because everything is maturing at different times. And so you really are thinking about, okay, when can I get something at one time point and get it off the field? So if you're thinking about doing mixtures, what matches well so that we're getting both of them out of the field at appropriate time slots.
I'd maybe go just a hair more specific. I would probably say that cereal rye is going to give you your best tonnage. And largely because it takes off and really goes in the spring much more rapidly than triticale or winter wheat. So you won't get a fall harvest out of that though. You need it to vernalize to really put out the shoots first. If you were trying to get some fall tonnage, then you might try oats or possibly even like a winter barley. But oats is going to give you more tonnage than a barley would.
So as Fred's starting to pick out, parts of the state. So now we have the bottom fourth of the state of Iowa, a little drier, drouthier, where corn silage might give way to sorghum Sudan grass. And so now is there anything different with the sorghum Sudan grass piece of the rotation compared to corn silage that might pick out a different cover crop?
Following a sorghum Sudan, I would probably still do, a cereal rye. Then you might get a little bit more fall tonnage, but the nice thing with it, like a sorghum Sudan, is that's where you might do a cocktail with it. You might pull out some sun hemp or, I'm blanking on a couple other species. There's other species that you could, there's some millets that you might throw in with it as well. And you might be able to get a little bit better quality out of it too, or more diverse species into it, from that standpoint.
I was just going to throw out there cowpea. That's a big one that gets mixed in with those.
Yep.
But yeah, I think that would be a good rotation as well if you're, even if it's a mixture versus a pure stand on what you're thinking about in those situations, going into one of those winter grains again, cereal rye, sorghum silage will follow a very similar pattern to corn silage if you're doing it in a monoculture.
Okay, so we talked a lot about types of cover crops. What about some guidelines of how and when to use them, or things to watch out for?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on this. And unfortunately, it's a lot of weather dependency. So if you can overseed into, a maturing crop, maybe right ahead of, silage, pulling that off, or if you've got, corn or soybean harvesting for grain, overseeding into those is your best opportunity to get decent production in the fall. And at least with cereal rye, the big thing with that is the better production you get in the fall or successive establishment, the better it's going to do in the spring. Now the downside is I can tell you that if you don't get rain, it's not going to grow, and you're just putting that seed right on top of that soil surface. And so that's the challenge. If you have the ability to do it yourself, then you can play the odds of watching the weather forecast and hoping hoping that 3 to 5 day forecast is accurate, right? We know, just from a uniformity standpoint, drilling any of the cover crops following, harvest, whether it's silage or grain harvest, that's going to be your best uniformity, best seed to soil contact. But especially following grain harvest, that could be the end of October into November. And by then you're not going to get much growth of anything. The nice part is that cereal rye at least will come up in the spring still. It'll just be a little bit more, I'll call it lethargic or slow with that spring growth.
As we're looking at these new crops, any tips on what we need to be watching out for as far as herbicides in the primary crop?
You kind of need to make sure that you're planning ahead. If you're thinking about using one of these cover crops, what cover crop are you using, checking your herbicide labels and any kind of carryover restrictions on those. Nobody wants to plant something that you end up just killing because you had a herbicide carryover situation. And so it's really just thinking about that rotation ahead of time and trying to plan for future uses.
The legumes and the brassicas are probably the most susceptible to residuals that are being carried over. And so those are the ones you need to watch out for. Cereal rye is pretty resilient. It'll do okay. Like annual ryegrass, I've even seen that have some issues with establishment because of carryover. So we just have to be careful, even with some of the grasses. But I'm much more concerned with the legumes and the brassicas.
So where can some of the listeners access some of these cover crop resources?
So quite honestly, the easiest way to find these fact sheets that we put together is trusting in Google and just doing a cover crop fact sheet, Iowa NRCS, and it will be the top one on the list.
That makes it pretty simple.
Yep. They're also on the extension store, but they link directly back over to the NRCS webpage. So that way we only have one place that's trying to count how many downloads and uses.
Okay. So what are the biggest takeaways from the podcast you want people to remember?
For me, it's really, accessing these types of materials, these fact sheets, when you start thinking about mixtures and what might work and what might not work, just to making sure that, you're getting to the goal that you want out of those cover crops. And that's really going to be the key there. You can buy predetermined mixtures and you may get a lot of species that you're paying money for that are not going to benefit you. And these fact sheets will help kind of parse out, what you're going to benefit from and what you might not.
Yeah, I would like to add, just really thinking about your goals. Your goals are what you're trying to reach. And so those fact sheets, just taking the information on them and using it to your best to apply to your situation. Also, you don't have to change all your acres in one go. Trying out different species here and there, like a few acres at a time, can be really beneficial in understanding what's going to work on your operation. I've seen so many times where one farmer will use a cover crop mix and it works amazing, and then the next one, it fails miserably. And so trying it out on smaller acres and working your way up.
Okay, so help me out with the labeling of this. Okay, so back in the day when we were kind of recommending this stuff, we would just call them, we're going to do like annual double crops, and then cover crops became kind of a thing here 5 to 8 years ago, and it just seemed like everything got thrown into the label of cover crops. I still think of them as annual crops. What's the difference?
Well, cover crops are designed to extend living roots following corn and soybeans for the most part, or when we don't have other cash crops out there. And in some situations we're taking a very lenient stance on that, right? And NRCS has allowed some of that. NRCS broadened that definition a little bit to allow for grazing, allow for some of that forage harvest. They just didn't want to see, so to speak, the transactional economics happening from harvest of it, right? And so that's probably the biggest thing that's kind of happened is, we started talking about soil health and how do we improve soil health, and you do that by having more living roots, more diverse roots in the soil. And so all the dairy farmers and cattle farmers that have these forages out there, they're way ahead of people that are solely corn soybean focused.
So Larry, I like that question because I always just think of them as forage. If that's the goal with them, we're using them. It is our forage. But I think Mark makes a good point. It kind of has to go with lining up with the NRCS and getting some of those benefits from using them. But yeah, so it's been a path, I guess.
Okay.
Because when people say summer cover crops, I'm like, you just mean summer forage? And so.
And we talk double cropping.
This has been kind of some exciting discussion. So let's look forward. What's some new research on new seeds? What's out there in your framework that our listeners will be able to see in the next couple of years?
I think Shelby and I are looking at each other. Who's going to bite first?
For it.
So my research, I'm a corn and soybean cropping system specialist, and so I've been focused, in my research, my extension, even my teaching, is focused, to a certain extent on how do we get cover crops into a corn and soybean system. And I'll qualify it here. 90% of the time, I'm talking about a corn and soybean system for grain, and I know that there's other corn out there, right? But that's the bulk of where I've spent my time. And so we've been really focused in on how can we minimize the impacts of cereal rye ahead of corn, because that has the most problems, quite honestly. And so we're dealing with pathogens in the soil. We're dealing with nitrogen immobilization. We're just dealing with I'll call it the timing of field operations at some operational levels. And so we're trying to learn on those and figure those out. We're looking at, I'll call it social distancing, to bring us back to our pandemic past, right? And then even strip tillage as a way of separating corn roots away from those rye roots. And so that's where we've been focused quite a bit. A new trial that we've just started here this past year. We're the crazy people that are cutting cereal rye biomass and moving it off onto a plot that it didn't grow in. So that way we can start to determine whether some of these impacts are truly from the above ground biomass that's produced or the below ground biomass. And so we're digging into this a little bit deeper than we have in the past.
Yeah, some of the research that I've been working on that just started this year, I'm really interested in seeing how we can extend that grazing season into the fall using some of our current systems that we have. Particularly one of them that I'm looking into is using like a sorghum Sudan grass, that multi-cut system. And after we cut it, going in directly right then and planting our, say, fall cover crop mix that we're trying to graze, and seeing if we can produce more biomass earlier on in the season so that we can enhance that fall time frame. Additionally, I have interest, hopefully in the future, we can get some research going on what are our actual impacts of using cover crops as a forage. having animals back on some of the landscape, and then also removing all the biomass from the field, and what kind of impacts are occurring because of that. And so those are some of the focuses that I'm having going into the next couple of years, and continued cover crop. I mean, cover crops aren't going away. Hopefully they continue to expand and increase throughout the state. And so just continuing those research as the need for what dairy producers and forage producers across the state are needing.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's been some great discussion. Anything else for the good of the cause? So if not, thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU Extension. Take care.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.